In this tutorial, we're going to look at how to do color correction in Photoshop. There are several ways you can do color correction in Photoshop. However, this method is fast, easy, and repeatable. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with this photo, and I'm going to have two photos for you guys to work on. But we're going to start with this photo, and using color correction, we're going to actually make it go from this blue cast to something that's much closer to reality. And then we're going to move on to this image. This is how the image starts, and that's how the image finishes. We're going to use the same methods for both, and in this you're going to also be introduced to the concept of an adjustment layer. So let's get started. First, go ahead and download bluesnow.psd from Blackboard and download cowboy.psd as well, so you have both of those images ready to go. So we've opened our photograph, and we currently have this snowy scene. Many of you living in Iowa may have taken photographs of snow only to have them come out with this insane blue cast to them, right? Everything here that should be like bright white snow actually looks blue, and that's because the way the light filters through the clouds, and our eyes adjust to that naturally. However, our cameras do not adjust to that color. So what we need to do is we need to make the adjustments that allow the camera, or the image that we've taken with our camera, to match reality. So to start with, we need to create we're going to create two different adjustment layers. The first adjustment layer is called curves. And adjustment layers are available right here above your layer panel. And so curves is this one with a curve on it. So I'm going to create this adjustment layer. And by default, this is not going to do anything whatsoever to the image, right? All it is doing is it's showing us this. This is called a histogram. And what this is showing us is where there are peaks in color, from black to white, where these different color areas peak, right? So we have a pretty strong peak just a little bit above total darkness. And then we have a couple other peaks here higher up, right? Those are probably red, blue, and green peaks that we're seeing, but they're all mashed together in this one layer. Now, I'm going to do this. Please don't do this, because then you'll just have to delete it and we'll have to restart, or we can whatever. But right, by just pulling this curve around, I can actually freehand some adjustments, and I can kind of do it by eye, or I can make really bad choices. So I'm going to undo that. And if you do get someplace with any of these adjustment layers and you want to go back to the defaults, there's this little reverse arrow here. If you click on that, it'll reset your settings. Okay, so we've got our curves layer. The next adjustment layer we're going to set is threshold. And so I'm going to click on threshold. Threshold should be above curves. And what this does is it essentially says anything above this point, right? There's from 0 to 255, or sorry, 1 to 255 are the possible values. And it essentially says 128 is halfway through. So anything that is quote unquote darker than this is going to be black, and anything that is lighter than this is going to be white. Now, you can use this to create all sorts of effects and actually use it in the photos, but you'll see as I go closer to black, right, there's less and less information. And when we get all the way down to true black, there's absolutely nothing. There's maybe one little speck on there. But as we start to pull in, then we start getting more areas of black. And the same goes true on the white end, right? We get nothing, nothing, nothing. And slowly we get stuff here. Now, ideally, we want our blacks and whites to be this entire range, right? That's a full tonal image. The fact that there's nothing happening here and there's nothing happening here means that this is a low contrast image. If this was higher contrast, we would actually have a broader range. We'd be able to stretch these colors, these peaks, all the way out to the edges. And so that's what we're going to start to do. And what threshold's going to allow us to do is say, okay, I'm going to pull this over, because we need, for color correction, we need to define a point that's black, a point that's white, and a point that is 50% gray. And so if we click on our curves real quick, you'll see we have these three eyedroppers. We have one with black, one with gray, and one with white. This is going to allow us to say this pixel color should be white, this pixel color should be black, and this pixel color should be 50% gray. And through that, it's going to automatically adjust the curve until it fits what we want. And so let's go ahead and go to threshold, and we're going to start with black. And we're going to pull this in. You know, I could go a little bit further, but I'm just going to stop. These are going to be big enough pixel areas. And then what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to use a special type, one of the special options under the eyedropper tool. And that is the color sampler tool. All this does is it puts little markers where we've chosen the colors. So what this allows us to do is to pick all three colors and then go back in and know where we grabbed them from and bring them into our curves menu. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in, and anywhere there's a big body of black, I'm going to go ahead and drop my first point. All right, so that's going to be my black point. Hold on a second, sorry. All right, so that's going to be my black point, and you'll see it also has a little number 1 next to it. And then I'm going to click on the thresholds again, and now you'll see once I clicked on that, it has this info panel up. If I click on the properties panel, then I'll be able to access the settings for my threshold again. So now I'm going to define a white point. So I'm going to go to the other side. I'm going to come in, and those are all pretty tiny speckles, so I'm just going to wait until I get a little bit bigger body of color. And I'm going to come over here. I'm going to zoom in here where I have enough space, and right about there is a good spot for the white point. Now we've defined a black point and a white point, and you can see them more clearly here, but we need to define gray, and that's going to require the creation of a special type of layer called a fill layer. And then we're going to color that fill layer so that it's 50% gray, and then use the blending mode to change how that interacts with the image below it. So first, let's select layer 1 because we want this fill layer to be directly on top of layer 1. And then we're going to go up to layer at the top of the screen, go down to new fill layer and solid color. You'll notice the layer menu has a ton of options, and we're actually going to use several of these options later in the course. But to start with, we just need a solid color fill. So we're going to say new fill layer, solid color. And color, we're just going to leave everything the same, except I might just change this to 50% gray so that if for some reason I didn't know what it was, I would have it labeled. And then once we create it, we need to tell it what color it's going to be. And to create 50% gray, all we need to do is go down to where the hue, saturation, and brightness settings are, right? Or the B here, not the blue B, but the 100%. And we just need to make this 50%, right? And suddenly we have 50% gray. We hit OK. All right, so now we have this solid fill color. And what we need to do is we need to change the blend mode from normal to difference. And difference is about, it's, you know, whatever, it's right down here. So first you're gonna be like, wow, that looks amazing. And it does. And what difference does is anything that's the same color, right? So anything that's 50% gray is going to show up as black on this image. And as colors get further apart from this color, this gray color, they're going to get closer and closer to white. So these areas are, this is the darker part of the tree, right? And this is the brighter part of the tree. And you can see this is also warmer in color and this is cooler in color because of the way it's separating. But what we're interested in are these dark areas right here in the center, because now that is going, one of these is going to be our gray point. But before we select a third point, we're going to turn back on our threshold. We're going to select it. We're going to make sure we click on properties so we can see it. And then we're going to pull this slider down, and we want to go to the black point. Right? We don't need to go to the center of this. We just need to go somewhere where we get just enough black coming in where it's definitely where we want it. So this looks pretty good, and I'm going to go ahead and zoom in. I know that somewhere in here is going to be gray, so I'm going to drop my third point there. All right, and so now I've got those 3 points chosen. And so I can turn off my threshold, and I can also turn off the visibility of my 50% gray, because we want the actual colors to be available. Otherwise, we're going to get really weird results when we go in and change these values on the curves. And so let's start with our white point, which is this bottom one here. And when you do this, you want to zoom in. Now you'll notice my when I zoom in, it goes all kinds of crazy on me. But I'm going to zoom in. I'm going to make sure I hit essentially the same pixel that I wanted before. And already you're going to notice a pretty dramatic change to the image. And then I'm going to find my black point. So I'm going to click on the black point tool here. Zoom into point 1 was my black point. And I'm just going to get a little bit closer. And this actually looks a little darker right next to it. So I'm going to use that one. Doesn't really matter, right? Okay. And then for gray, I'm going to click on the gray, and I'm going to go down to number 3 here. And zoom way in and click on that. And you'll see it really warms the image up. Okay, so now if I turn the visibility off on my curves, you're going to see the difference, right? So this is our original image, and this is our color corrected image. And right, this looks much more like it should. Now, if for some reason we're not happy with the color in here, right? This isn't a great photo. It's a pretty terrible photo to start with. But if we adjust the opacity, we can always make this effect less. Like if we do want it to be a little blue, a little cooler, we can modify it here to make that happen. So one last thing we need to do, or I guess two last things we need to do to finish this up, is we need to get rid of these points, right? We don't need them there anymore, so we need to delete them. So if you hover over them until your cursor changes to an arrow with a dot next to it, and then right click, your first option is to delete. And that's what we're going to do. And then we're going to hover over here, we're going to right click, delete, and then find our gray point, there it is, right click and delete. So those three are gone. All right, and now we can also delete our threshold and our 50% gray layer because we don't need those any longer. Now, depending on your use and why you're doing this, this would be a great place to leave your image, right? You've got your layer that if you want to go back to the original, you can, and you've got your curve set. But sometimes if you're working fast, if this is just going to be a small part of a larger image that you're constructing, then what you can do is you can come up to this little panel control here for the layers panel, and we can go down. Oh, and I didn't select anything, so it's not letting me do this. So we can select the curves layer and then hold down Shift and select layer 1. And now when we click on this, we have a lot more options available to us. And we can go down to flatten image or merge layers, or merge visible. All of these will do exactly the same thing, right? If you have certain layers that are still there that aren't visible, that you want to keep separate, you can do merge visible, merge layers, merges whichever ones you have selected, and flatten image just flattens everything. So I'm going to flatten this image. Right? Okay, so now I have something that I can select. If I want this tree to be in some other image, I can select this, copy and paste it in there. Now, with what we're doing potentially a lot of manipulation of images, a lot of combining multiple images together. And so this is the first step that you should do when you're in that process. You should take all of your images and do this simple thing to get the color right. Then you can go back in and make dramatic changes to the color. You can modify things in other ways. But if you start with all of your images in the same tonal range, then you're going to be ahead of the game. Okay, so we've done this image. Let's go ahead and take a look at another image. And that's this cowboy image. The reason we're doing this one is because even once we get done with this, I want to show you that there's a couple other things you can do to increase the quality of the image or start to modify it a bit more, even if everything you've done doesn't work out quite right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and do this quickly, and I'd like you guys to have this image open and practice. Do the same steps you just did with the snow. And one thing to note when you're setting the black point, you'll see there's this big spike right where the very edge is, and that's because the border is black. We're not so concerned about the border. You may want to make, because it's just the border of the film, you want to make sure that the black in the image, that's what you're actually selecting, right? And in this case, there are some really nice dark areas here. So I'm going to go ahead and set a point. All right, so hopefully your results look something like this, right? Depending on which, if this pixel's a little bit more blue or a little bit more green, it's going to make a difference in how this image looks, right? It's going to be off by just a hair. But once you get it close, this is a much improved image than this, right? This definitely has a greenish, yellowish color cast to it, and that's partly because of the film that was used to record this, and the age of the film gave it that color cast, right? So now, but through the power of digital technology, we can remove those artifacts and get a much more true color image. Now, we've gotten to this point. Let's go ahead and delete our threshold and delete our fill color. But say we're not quite happy with this, or we want to go a couple steps further, or now that we've got a color corrected image, we actually want to give it maybe a different color cast, so it looks like it's filtered in a different way. So to start with, one of the other adjustment layers, and I suggest you experiment with all of them. Some of them have a lot more controls, some of them have fewer controls. The one that I want to start with is brightness and contrast. So let's go ahead and click on that. And this just has two controls. And I'm just going to leave these points on here for the time being. It doesn't really matter. But with brightness and contrast, right, if I crank up the contrast, the darker areas are going to be darker and the highlights are going to be brighter, right? And so if I just keep going, you'll see what happens, right? It becomes much more contrasty, for lack of a better word. I'm going to go back down to 0. And brightness, which should make sense, right? It's going to brighten the entire image, and you're going to get, it's eventually going to blow out the highlights, which is the technical term for when you lose all color information, or vice versa. If we go darker, right, it's going to look like it's an underexposed image. And so, but through combination of this, I can bring this up, right? It's a little bit darker in the gray areas than I'd like it. Like I'd like it to pop a little bit more. So if I just brighten it up a little bit and even add just a touch of contrast, it's going to make the image, and maybe that's a little bit too much contrast, it's going to make the image pop a little bit more than it would have otherwise. So I can, and let me pull this on top of it doesn't really matter which order it's in, right? But you can see that just by doing that, I've just made the image a little bit more dynamic. It's a little bit sharper and crisper looking than it was before. So that's one way that you can then, after you have your colors set, you can then go in and make something look nice. Now, other things you can do is, there's a ton of options, but let's look at the photo filter, right? So this allows you to apply a color cast to the entire image. So if I turn this off, you can see this is this still has kind of this greenish cast to it. And photo filters allow you to essentially warm things up or cool things off, right? The default is this warming filter. The density says essentially how strong do I want this to be applied, right? I can make this really, really, really yellow and not so hot, right? 25% is the default setting. If you uncheck preserve luminosity, it's going to apply, right? You'll see it kind of dims the thing. It applies the filter more evenly across all the highlights. Whereas if you check mark that, then you still get these white highlights. They don't turn orange or blue or whatever color your filter ends up being. So let's say we do 25%. I actually like this, right? I want it to be a little warmer. They have another option here, which is the LBA. Oh, I should probably check mark preserve luminosity. All right, so you can see that that effect is slightly different. I don't know how warm you want this to be, but there's tons of different options. There's underwater, right, which kind of puts us back to where we started. Sepia makes it look more old-timey, right? Like it essentially washes out the color and makes everything a little bit more brown. So it really depends on what you're going for in your final image, but adjustment layers give you a lot of control over modifying the color. But it's always best to start with true color, to start by getting the color corrected and then working from there.